Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tales, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The rain had begun before dusk, steady and unhurried, as if the clouds themselves had grown tired of holding back. Each drop touched the sea with a small sigh, rippling across the black water that surrounded the lighthouse. Inside, a lamp glowed. On the wooden table, soft amber light breathing against the walls, painting them in gold and shadow. The keeper moved slowly, his steps measured, careful not to disturb the quiet that had settled after years of storms. He filled a small kettle, set it over the flame, and listened to the hiss of water meeting heat, a sound that somehow felt like company. Outside, the waves lapped against the rocks below, their rhythm familiar as a heartbeat. The wind whispered around the tower, brushing past the windows with the gentleness of an old friend. Somewhere, a rope creaked, a reminder that everything here, the lantern, the stones, even the man himself, had learned to bend, not break. He wore a thick sweater, the kind with sleeves too long, and his hands were rough from salt and years of tending. His name was Elias, though few ever used it. To the few fishermen who still passed this way, he was simply the keeper. They would wave at the beam that swept across the sea each night, grateful perhaps for a light they never saw but always trusted. As the kettle began to sing, Elias poured the water over dried leaves in a chipped porcelain cup. The smell of tea filled the room, faintly floral, slightly bitter, grounding. He took the cup to the window, watching how the rain slid down. The glass, each drop tracing a path that vanished into the sill. There was something soothing about the way the world blurred beyond the glass, the line between sky and sea disappearing until all that was left was gray and sound. He thought, not for the first time, that the lighthouse felt like the world's pause button. While the mainland kept its hurried pace, cars, clocks, and conversations he no longer remembered. Here, time was measured in tides and storms. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of small things. The hum of the lantern, the ticking of the old barometer, the whisper of pages when he turned them in his logbook. He sat by the table and opened a worn leather-bound notebook. Its pages smelled faintly of salt and smoke. Tonight, he thought he might write again, not reports for the harbor office or notes about wind direction, but something else. Something meant for no one, or maybe for something. He smiled at the thought. A man alone long enough might start writing letters to the rain or to the sea. He dipped his pen, hesitated, then began. Dear sea, you've been restless today. I can tell by how you keep touching the rocks, as if testing them for cracks. The rain makes you softer, though, almost kind. I hope the gulls found shelter before the wind grew sharp. The lantern's steady tonight. I've trimmed its wick just so, and it breathes golden through the mist. I wonder if you see it? He paused, looking up at the lantern's faint reflection on the glass. Outside, the beam turned slow circles, brushing fog and rain with quiet patience. The sea didn't answer, not in words, but he could feel its weight against the night, deep and alive. Elias took another sip of tea. Warmth slid down his throat, chasing away the damp chill that always lingered near the stones. He remembered when this room was loud, back when the last keeper still lived here, when laughter sometimes echoed in the stairwell. Now the only laughter came from memory, faint and polite, like a ghost careful not to startle. He leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the storm. The walls creaked. The rain thickened, drumming on the roof. Yet inside, the lamp burned steady and the air was calm. He thought of all the ships out there, tracing invisible paths across the dark sea, trusting a single circle of light to guide them home. How strange, he mused, that people often built their safest places in the loneliest corners of the world. He closed his eyes fully now, the letter unfinished, his cup half empty. The rain slowed, as if the night itself had taken a deep breath. Somewhere beyond the window, the horizon blurred into sleep. The light above continued its slow rotation, slicing through fog and memory alike, steady as a promise. And for a moment, just a moment, Elias believed that the sea was listening. Morning arrived quietly, without sunrise, only a paler shade of gray settling over the sea. The storm had drifted east some time before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. Droplets clung to the iron railing outside, trembling in the breeze before falling soundlessly into the surf. Inside the lighthouse, the keeper moved through his small rituals, silent, practiced, gentle. Elias lit the stove and warmed what was left of yesterday's tea, pouring it into a mug that had lost its handle long ago. He didn't mind. The cracks and stains told a kind of story he understood. He ate a piece of bread hardened by the night air, spread with honey that glowed faintly gold in the morning dim. It was enough. The lantern above still burned, its great glass eyes sweeping the water. Elias climbed the spiral stairs, feeling the familiar weight of them in his knees. The steps were narrow, cool to the touch, echoing faintly under his boots. At the top, the air smelled of oil and salt and faint smoke. He reached for the brass handle, warm from the light, and adjusted the flame just slightly. A small gesture, but one that made him feel useful, necessary. He wiped condensation from the window, revealing the wide, soft expanse of the sea. It moved lazily now, breathing slow after the storm. A few seabirds drifted low, their wings skimming the surface like strokes of white ink. Elias watched them with quiet affection. He had learned to see them as company, the kind that never overstayed, never demanded more than attention. When he was done, he made notes in his logbook. Wind from west, light. Sea calm, lantern steady. The letters slanted slightly, his handwriting weathered like him, still careful, but slower now. Below the line he added, almost as an afterthought, rain lingered in my dreams. He stayed by the lantern for a while longer, listening to the wind hum through the metal ribs of the tower. Then he descended, each turn of the staircase like unwinding a thought. Downstairs, the clock ticked softly. The walls still held the faint scent of smoke from last night's fire. He took out a small cloth and began wiping the wooden table, the shelf, the frame of the window. It was an unnecessary task. There was hardly any dust here, but it filled the quiet with purpose. A lighthouse was a simple thing to tend, but it required rhythm. Rhythm kept the loneliness from swelling into noise. Once, years ago, a younger man might have whistled while he worked. Now Elias only hummed under his breath, tuneless and low. The sound mingled with the murmur of waves outside, forming a kind of music that no one else would ever hear. When he had finished tidying, he stepped outside for a moment. The cold air brushed against his face, carrying the smell of seaweed and iron. He closed his eyes and felt the faint drizzle settle in his beard. Around him, the world was vast and empty, yet never cruel. It was the kind of solitude that didn't punish, only revealed. He looked down the rocky path that led to the shore, narrow, slick with moss, ending where waves met the stones. Sometimes, when the tide was low, he would walk there to gather driftwood or check for debris. Today, though, he simply watched. The sea was still gray, but there was a soft light beneath the surface, a pulse he could almost feel. He thought about how many mornings had passed like this. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Each the same, yet not quite. Time here didn't move forward so much as fold gently around itself, like waves returning to shore. There was comfort in that, the predictability of it. Inside again, Elias sat by the window with his tea. He opened his notebook, where last night's letter waited unfinished. The ink had bled slightly from the damp air, turning his words softer, almost fragile. He reread the last line, I wonder if you see it." He smiled faintly and added, "I suppose you always do." Then, instead of signing his name, he drew a small circle, a habit from long ago. To him, it meant continuity. To anyone else, it would mean nothing at all. Outside, the clouds thickened again, rushing low over the sea. The first drops began to fall, tapping lightly on the roof. Elias leaned back in his chair, feeling the rhythm settle into the day. The rain was not an interruption. It was a return. He would trim the wick again later, write another letter perhaps. For now, he simply watched as the horizon blurred, and the world became once more a watercolor of gray and sound in that small circle of light. The keeper and his lighthouse moved together, one tending, one shining, both quietly alive in the gentle hum of rain. The rain grew heavier by afternoon, thick and slanting, pushed by the wind that curled around the cliffs. It wasn't a violent kind of storm, just steady, insistent, the kind that blurred distance and softened edges until the world became sound more than sight. Inside, Elias sat at the table, his tea long gone cold. The notebook opened to a fresh page. He dipped his pen in ink and wrote at the top, slowly and carefully, "Dear C." Then he paused, letting the pen rest between his fingers. The tip glimmered faintly in the lamp's glow. He didn't always know what to say at first. Words came like a tide, not when called, but when ready. After a while, he began again. "You've been restless these past days. I can hear it in the way you breathe. I wonder if the rain comforts you as it does me, if it fills your deep places, makes you softer for a time." He stopped to listen. Beyond the window, the wind hummed against the glass, and the sea answered with a long, low sigh. It sounded almost like a response. Elias smiled faintly. He continued writing, his hand steady despite the damp. "When the fog rolls in, I can't see you, but I know you're there, vast and certain, even when hidden. Maybe that's what faith feels like. Not loud, just steady." He sat back, pen hovering. It was strange, he thought, to write to something that never wrote back, though perhaps that was the point. The sea listened. It never interrupted, never judged. Some days, that was enough. Elias looked around the small room. The wood panels were dark with age, the corners lined with shelves of oil tins, old journals, and folded charts whose edges had curled with humidity. Everything here bore the same quiet patience, as if it too had learned to wait. He added another line. "The gulls have gone inland today. Even the wind seems to be hiding. It's just you and me, old friend. And yet, I don't feel alone." He let the words sit there, ink pooling slightly in one corner of the page. Then he closed the book gently, as though putting the sea to sleep. Outside, the lighthouse beam began its slow rotation. The lens turned with a faint mechanical sigh, slicing light into the fog. Elias climbed the stairs to check the lantern, his hand trailing along the cold rail. Each step echoed upward, a hollow rhythmic heartbeat at the top. He looked out through the glass. The world was a moving watercolor, mist, light, water, all shifting and breathing as one. Far below, waves broke against the rocks with a soft roar, spraying white foam into the wind. It looked almost like smoke from a quiet fire. He pressed a hand to the window. The glass vibrated faintly with the storm. He thought of how fragile it was, a single pane between him and the vast, living sea. Yet it had held for years, as had he when he descended again. The room felt smaller but warmer. He lit a second lamp, its glow spilling across the desk and into the corners. The rain softened to a whisper. The sound of it on the roof was almost like breathing beside him. He sat again, opening a different drawer, the one with older letters. Inside were pages folded neatly, some yellowed with age, others nearly knew. Each began the same, "Dear Sea." He read one dated 4 years ago. "You are quiet today. I tried to remember what silence felt like before I came here. I couldn't. Maybe this is what it means to belong, to find stillness in the noise of another thing." He touched the edge of the page, feeling the faint texture of the ink. There was comfort in these small marks, proof that he had lived, that his thoughts had once crossed into the world, even if only for himself. The rain thickened again, drumming on the window. Elias reached for his coat and stepped outside for a moment. The air was cold, sharp with salt, but alive. The beam of the lighthouse swept across him every few seconds, painting his figure in brief flashes of gold before fading back into gray. He looked toward the horizon, or where it should have been, and whispered softly, "You heard me, didn't you?" The sea didn't answer, but a wave crashed louder than the rest, spraying mist across his face. He smiled, closing his eyes against it. Maybe that was enough of a reply. Back inside, he hung his coat to dry and poured himself another cup of tea. The cup trembled slightly in his hands, but his heart felt steady. He opened the notebook once more and wrote, in smaller letters this time, "Tonight, I write not because I am lonely, but because I am listening." The ink glistened faintly before sinking into the paper, quiet as rain on wood. And outside, the sea kept breathing, patient, endless, and kind. It had been 15 years since Elias first climbed the narrow stairs of the lighthouse, his hands trembling from cold and uncertainty. He remembered that day as clearly as if it were carved into the stones themselves. The low roar of the tide, the smell of rust and seaweed, and the way the light above turned slow circles through the fog, as if searching for him. Back then, the world beyond the shore had already begun to drift away from him. There had been a house once, a small one with blue shutters, and a garden full of mint and rain lily. A woman had lived there too, her laughter brighter than any lantern flame. But she was gone before the second spring, carried off by illness and silence. After that, Elias had needed distance, from voices, from roads, from the kind of mornings that expected you to smile. So he came here. The lighthouse had been unmanned for a decade, half forgotten by the mainland, but still standing. The sea had eaten away at its edges. The walls had worn thin with salt, yet its light still burned when coaxed to life. He had taken that as a sign that some things, even when neglected, refused to stop shining. The first night he slept here, the rain came in from every direction, seeping through the windows, whispering under the door. He had lain awake, listening to the beams creak, feeling the ocean breathe beneath the floorboards. It was both terrifying and intimate, like sleeping inside another living thing. He thought of turning back, of catching the morning ferry to somewhere brighter. But then dawn had arrived, soft and silver, and the sea, calm as glass, had looked at him with something like forgiveness. He stayed. That was the beginning of a new kind of time, the slow, circular kind. Each morning brought the same tasks: cleaning the glass, trimming the wick, measuring the wind, writing reports that no one read. At first, he counted the days on a calendar nailed to the wall. Then the pages yellowed and tore, and he stopped counting. The tides were calendar enough. There was a rhythm to it, a tenderness even in solitude. The chores became gestures of devotion. The lantern polished not just for ships, but for himself, for the quiet satisfaction of seeing light move cleanly through glass. He came to love the sounds that once unnerved him, the sigh of ropes in wind, the distant crash of waves on rock, the soft click of the clock marking each hour like a heartbeat. He remembered his first letter to the sea. It had been written that first winter, a stormy night when the world outside was all thunder and foam. The letter had no beginning, just a single line. "Are you lonely too?" He never sent it, of course. There was nowhere to send it to. But the act of writing had filled the room with warmth that night, and he had kept the habit ever since. Elias leaned back now, his chair creaking faintly. The rain had returned, tapping a slow rhythm on the windows. He could smell salt and oil, the familiar perfume of this life. He turned the pages of his current notebook, tracing with his finger the faint indentations where old letters had been written. So many nights recorded here, each a small flicker of thought, a light of its own. He rose and went to the lantern room again, just to look. The stairs curved upward like a spine, and he followed, lantern in hand. At the top, he pushed open the heavy door. The room was filled with the soft sound of wind threading through iron. Outside, the world was gray on gray, the horizon invisible. But in the midst of it, the beam kept turning. Patient, certain, kind. He ran a cloth over the brass casing, watching the light refract in tiny rainbows. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass. An older man now, hair turned the color of ash, face softened by years of sea wind. Yet there was peace in it, a stillness that had taken root so deeply it no longer felt like loneliness. He stayed there for a while, simply breathing with the light. The rain played its gentle percussion on the dome above, and the world below was only motion and sound. When he finally descended, dusk had begun to fall. He lit the small lamp by his desk and opened a fresh page. "Dear C," he wrote, "I've been thinking about that first night. How you frightened me. How you made me small. I think that's how love begins. Not with comfort, but with awe. You took everything noisy inside me and replaced it with your rhythm. For that, I am grateful." He paused, listening to the words as if they were spoken aloud. Then he smiled, a small private curve of the mouth, and added one last line, "I am still here. And I think, in some way, you are too." He set down the pen, folded the page carefully, and placed it beside the others. Outside, the beam turned another slow circle across the sea, a pulse of light steady in the storm that Elias watched it from his chair, the reflection dancing across his tea. It felt, in that moment, as though the whole world had taken one deep, calm breath, and he breathed with it. By the third evening, the wind began to rise again. It came low and heavy from the south, pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. Elias stood by the door, coat collar turned up, watching the horizon fade beneath a thick sheet of cloud. The air smelled of rain and copper, the unmistakable warning of another storm. He had learned to read storms the way other men read books. The color of the sky told him their moods. The shape of the waves whispered their intent. The small barometer by the window, its needle trembling toward falling, confirmed what instinct had already known. There would be thunder before midnight. He didn't mind. Storms made the lighthouse feel alive. Each creak, each gust, each flash of light, they reminded him that this place still had a heart. Inside, he prepared as he always did. He checked the oil, secured the shutters, tied the rope across the outer door. Then he lit the main lamp early, letting its golden eye sweep through the gray. A steady heartbeat pulsing through the mist dot as the first drops began to fall. Elias brewed tea again, black this time, strong and sharp. He carried the cup upstairs, climbing slowly, the mug warming his palms. When he reached the lantern room, the storm had already found its rhythm. Rain hammered the glass in great sweeping arcs. Lightning flashed, turning the sea white for an instant before sinking back into shadow. He sat on the wooden stool beside the lens, sipping slowly, feeling the thunder in his chest. It was strange how something so fierce could feel so familiar. Over time, the storms had become less frightening and more like a kind of conversation. Loud, yes, but honest. He thought of what he'd written in his last letter. How love begins not with comfort, but with awe. He smiled faintly. Yes, this was awe. The world stripped of its calm, showing its full power, and yet still, somehow, beautiful. The thunder rolled again, longer this time, shaking the tower. Elias placed his cup down and steadied the lamp's frame with both hands. "Easy," he murmured, as if calming a restless horse. The light flared once, then settled, its beam steady against the dark. He stayed there for hours, tending the flame, watching how it cut through rain and fog. He thought of the sailors far out at sea, following that single thread of light home. None of them would ever know his name, but they would know the light. That was enough. When the storm was at its loudest, Elias felt something rise inside him, not fear, but memory. A sudden image of the woman he once loved standing in a doorway, rain soaking her hair. She had been laughing that day, her voice tangled with thunder. "You always chase the storms?" she'd teased. "Maybe that's why you understand them." He could almost hear it now, that laughter carried in the wind. He closed his eyes, letting the sound merge with the storm's symphony. He whispered into the noise, "You'd like it here." The room flickered with light. For a brief moment, the sea below glimmered silver, every wave outlined in white. Then darkness again, thick and full of sound. He picked up his pen, the one that always seemed to find its way to his hand during storms, and opened his notebook on the windowsill. The page trembled and the wind slipped through the seams. "Dear Sea," he wrote, his handwriting a little uneven, "you roar tonight. I think you need to be heard as much as I do. Maybe that's why we get along. We both pretend to be calm when we're anything but. I don't fear you anymore. I listen." A gust rattled the door, and a drop of rain fell onto the page, blurring the word "listen." He left it there. "Every storm," he continued, "is a reminder that stillness always returns, that nothing stays loud forever." When he finished, he set the notebook aside and leaned against the glass. His reflection shimmered faintly over the sea's wild movement. An old man and 1,000 crashing waves sharing one restless night. Hours passed. The thunder moved farther away. The rain softened, fell straight again. The lighthouse walls groaned in relief. Elias trimmed the wick one last time and turned down the flame until it glowed steady, quiet, alive. Downstairs, he sat near the hearth and warmed his hands over the coals. The storm's final whispers lingered in the chimney. A sigh, a memory, a promise. He thought again of the line he'd just written. Nothing stays loud forever. Outside, the sea was already smoothing itself back to calm, the surface turning silver beneath a hidden moon. Elias smiled, tired but content. The world had roared and softened again, and the light had never gone out. He took one last sip of cold tea, closed his eyes, and listened, not to thunder now, but to the rain easing into peace. The storm left behind a strange kind of silence, not empty, but thick and breathing, like the world had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. The sea was calm, but restless in its calmness, the waves rolling with slow sighs that broke softly against the rocks. The sky still wore a haze of pale gray, its edges faintly silver where the sun tried to return. Elias woke later than usual. His body ached from the long night, shoulders heavy, fingers stiff, but his heart felt strangely light. He boiled water, the kettle's whistle rising in gentle spirals through the still air. The smell of tea leaves filled the room again, mingling with the faint scent of oil and salt. As he sat, wrapping his hands around the mug, he noticed something on the windowsill, a small shape, yellow against the damp stone. At first, he thought it was a leaf. Then he saw it was a slicker, a piece of oilskin, torn from a raincoat, fluttering lightly in the breeze. He frowned softly, leaning closer. It hadn't been there last night. He opened the window, and the cool morning air brushed against his face, carrying the smell of wet rope and distant pine. Down near the shoreline, A figure was moving, faint through the mist, dressed in yellow. For a moment, Elias thought it was memory playing tricks. But no, there it was again, a person walking along the rocks, steady despite the slippery surface. A visitor, the first in months. He hesitated before going out, his boots still damp from yesterday, but something in him stirred, curiosity, perhaps, or the simple need for another voice. He put on his coat and stepped outside. The air wrapped around him cold and gentle, the kind of chill that felt like clarity dot. As he approached the edge of the path, the figure turned. It was a woman, her raincoat bright against the gray sea. She had dark hair pulled into a loose knot, and her hands were cupped around something small, a seashell. He realized as she lifted it in greeting. "Morning," she called softly, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Elias nodded. "Morning," he replied, surprised at how unused his voice sounded. She smiled, a small, honest thing that didn't need explanation. "I thought the lighthouse might still be empty," she said. "Didn't expect to find anyone living here." "I tend the light," he answered simply. "Every night?" "Everyone that needs tending." She stepped closer, the stones clicking under her boots. "I used to watch this light when I was a girl. My father was a fisherman. He said the man who kept it never missed a night." Elias looked away for a moment, toward the sea. "He didn't," he murmured. "Nor did the ones after him." She held out the shell, small, pink, polished smooth by the tide. "The sea left this near my boat. I thought it should come back here. Seems fitting." He took it carefully, feeling its weight, light but real. "Thank you," he said. The woman nodded, glancing around the tower. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how peaceful it feels here after a storm. Like everything's been forgiven." Elias looked at her then, really looked. The kindness in her eyes, the way her hair caught bits of light through the mist. For a heartbeat, the world tilted slightly, as if a memory had stepped forward to see itself. "You're welcome to come in," he said at last. "There's tea. It's not much, but it's warm." She smiled again. "I'd like that." Inside, the air still held the faint hum of the storm, but it was softer now, almost musical. She hung her raincoat near the door, the yellow fabric dripping slowly into a small puddle. He poured her tea into his second cup, the one with a crack near the rim. They sat in quiet for a while, the sound of the kettle soft behind them, rain whispering through the last threads of cloud. She looked around the room, her gaze gentle but curious. "You must get lonely," she said after a while. Elias shook his head. "Only sometimes," he said. "But the sea listens. And the light, it keeps me company." She smiled, tracing her finger along the rim of her cup. "I understand. My father used to say the same thing about the ocean, that it listens better than people." He nodded slowly. "Perhaps that's why so many of us talk to it." They didn't say much more after that. Words felt unnecessary. The air between them carried its own quiet conversation, one of understanding, of shared solitude. When she finally stood to leave, she placed her hand briefly on the table, as if to steady the moment. "I'll come by again when the sea's calm," she said. "I'll keep the light on." Elias replied. She looked back at him from the doorway, her raincoat catching the last trace of sunlight that had managed to find its way through the clouds. "You always do," she said softly. Then she was gone, a flash of yellow moving down the rocks, fading into mist until only the sound of the waves remained. Elias sat for a long time, holding the shell she'd given him. He turned it in his hand, pressing it to his ear like a boy might, listening for the sea inside. And there it was, faint, infinite, breathing. He smiled to himself and placed it beside his letters on the desk. Outside, the sky cleared just enough for a single beam of light to touch the water. The sea shimmered as if nodding back, And in that stillness, Elias felt the quiet joy of being seen. Not by many, not even for long, but enough. That night, long after the woman in the yellow coat had disappeared into the mist, Elias sat by his desk with the shell in front of him. The lamp's light caught its pale curve, turning it into something both delicate and eternal. He touched it once, then again, as if making sure it was real. The sea had given him many things over the years: driftwood, broken glass, the occasional message in a bottle, but nothing quite like this. Nothing that carried warmth. He opened his notebook and turned to a blank page. The ink had dried slightly thick from the damp air, and the pen's first stroke left a dark bloom before thinning into smoothness. "Dear C," he began, "I had a visitor today. You must have sent her, or at least guided her here. She wore yellow, a color I haven't seen inside these walls for too long. She left me a shell, small enough to fit in my palm. It hums when I listen. I think it carries your voice." He paused. The rain outside had slowed to a soft murmur, each drop distinct now, no longer in chorus. The kind of rain that didn't need to be watched, only felt. "I used to write letters that never found their way to anyone," he continued. "Letters to the living, to the gone, to myself. I thought if I wrote enough, someone might answer. Maybe that's why I began writing to you. You never said a word, but you never left either. Perhaps silence is the kindest reply." He leaned back, letting his eyes wander to the window. The sea was calm again, dark, wide, and breathing under the moon. He thought of the woman walking away earlier, her yellow coat flickering like a lantern in fog. It had stirred something he hadn't felt in years. Not longing exactly, but recognition. The simple grace of being seen, even briefly. He closed the notebook and reached for the small, wooden box under the table, the one that held all his unsent letters. The lid creaked as he opened it, the faint scent of paper and salt rising like memory. The pages inside were unevenly folded, some yellowed with age, others still white and crisp. He lifted one from near the bottom, an old one, written in ink that had turned faintly brown. He unfolded it slowly, his heart tightening even before he began to read. The handwriting was neater then, younger. The words were simple. "Dearest Lila, I've left the house by the bay. The mint has grown wild without you, and the windows creak in every wind. I think you would have liked the lighthouse. It feels like the world's edge, but it's gentle here. I'll write again once the sea teaches me how to sleep." He ran a finger over her name. It still hurt, but softly now, like an old scar that remembered its purpose. That letter had never been sent. He had written it the day he arrived here, before the silence became familiar. He'd folded it, sealed it, and placed it in the box as if the act itself could count as farewell. Elias refolded it and placed it beside the shell. He didn't know why, only that it felt right, as if one story had been waiting all this time for the other to arrive. He poured himself another cup of tea, though it had gone cold, and watched the steam fade before it could rise. The sound of waves filled the room in soft intervals. Somewhere outside, the light above turned another circle, casting its beam through fog and glass, painting the walls in slow-moving gold. The rhythm of it matched his heartbeat. He spoke into the quiet, not to anyone, not even to himself, but to the space between everything. "Maybe the sea does write back," he said softly. "It just takes its time." He took a deep breath, letting the words linger, and reached for his pen again. On the same page as his last letter, beneath the closing line, he added, "I never sent your letter either, you know. It sits in a box next to the life I didn't live. But maybe that's all right. Some letters are meant to stay home." He smiled faintly at that, set the pen down, and looked once more at the shell. He lifted it to his ear and listened. It sounded, as always, like rain far away, falling on water, endless and kind. For the first time in years, he felt no need to write anything else. The silence that filled the room was complete but gentle, a silence that understood. Elias blew out the lamp. The glow dimmed, leaving only the slow, steady pulse of the lighthouse above. The sea breathed below, patient as sleep dot in the dark. He whispered one last time, "Good night, Lila." And somewhere, beneath the rain's returning hush, the sea whispered back, not in words, but in a soft, rhythmic answer that felt like forgiveness. The following morning unfolded with a hush, so complete it felt almost sacred. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving behind air so clear, carried the scent of salt and moss from far down the cliffs. The light filtering through the clouds was pale and silver, the kind that didn't cast shadows but filled them in. Elias woke to the faint hum of the lantern above. Its beam still turned, slow and faithful, cutting through the mist like a pulse. He sat up in bed and listened to the faint creak of ropes, the soft drip from the eaves, the heartbeat of waves against the stone base. Every sound here was familiar, yet each morning they sounded slightly new, like the world quietly adjusting its rhythm to his breathing. He rose, washed his face in cold water, and lit the small stove. The first hiss of flame filled the kitchen, followed by the sharp, comforting scent of boiling tea. He moved through the space as though he'd been born to it, opening windows, checking the oil lamp, noting the sea's mood without needing to look. Routine in this place was not repetition. It was prayer. After breakfast, he climbed the spiral stairs again. The lantern room was warm from the night's work, glass fogged slightly around the edges. The great Fresnel lens turned with its slow, hypnotic rhythm, scattering thin ribbons of light across the walls. Elias reached for a clean cloth and began polishing the brass fittings. He did this every morning, not because it needed to shine, though it did, but because it made him feel connected, part of the same purpose as the light itself. He spoke softly as he worked, as if the lantern were an old friend that preferred whispers. "You did well last night," he said. "You always do." The lens, catching sunlight now, refracted it into soft halos around his hands. He could see his reflection in the glass, faint, wavy, as if drawn in water. His beard was whiter than he remembered, his skin lined like old parchment. Yet his eyes, in the reflection, still carried that quiet glimmer, the same one that had followed him through storms, letters, and loss. When he finished, he stepped back to look at the lamp. It stood gleaming, breathing in the morning air that drifted through the small ventilation window. Outside, gulls wheeled lazily over the surf, their cries sharp and distant. He sat down on the narrow bench beneath the window. The light warmed his shoulder, and for a moment, the world seemed to exist in two equal halves, the chaos of sea and sky on one side, and the stillness of brass and flame on the other. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small shell. It was smooth and cool against his palm, its spiral perfect as if drawn by patient hands. He held it to his ear and closed his eyes. The sound inside was softer now, less like the roar of surf and more like breathing, steady, near. He smiled. "I think you approve," he murmured. The light, the letter, the silence. He slipped the shell into the pocket of his coat again and looked out at the sea. A thin streak of sun had begun to push through the clouds, gilding the water with silver. Somewhere out there, a fishing boat cut across the horizon, a tiny silhouette moving through the shimmer. He thought of how many nights he had guided those unseen boats, how many strangers had trusted the glow from this lonely tower without ever knowing the man who kept it. That thought no longer carried loneliness, only quiet pride. Perhaps this was what purpose felt like when stripped of ambition. The simple joy of tending something that would never bear your name by noon, The air had grown warmer. He descended the stairs and opened the heavy door to the outside. The sea breeze greeted him with a scatter of salt spray. He walked the narrow path around the lighthouse, his boots crunching over damp gravel. Grass sprouted between the stones, bright green from the rain. He paused by the edge where the cliffs met the sea. From here, he could see everything. The dark, endless water stretching into mist, the sunlight shifting in gentle waves, the faint trace of distant land. The lighthouse behind him hummed faintly, its lantern turning above like the slow beat of a heart. Elias took a deep breath. The air was cold and clean, tinged with something sweet from the wet earth. He closed his eyes and let the wind move through his hair, through the loose threads of his coat. "I think," he said softly, "you've made peace with me too." He stood there a long time, listening to the low hush of waves against stone. Every crash sounded like an answer, slow, patient, inevitable. When he finally returned inside, he wrote only one line in his notebook: "The sea keeps its promises in silence." He placed the pen down, folded his hands, and let the quiet settle again. Outside, the beam continued its slow revolution, light gliding across the calm water, touching everything without needing to stay. Elias watched it until the horizon began to glow faintly pink, the day softening into evening once more. And as he sat beside the lantern's hum, the thought came to him, clear, gentle, unspoken, that maybe the light wasn't meant to chase away darkness at all. Maybe it was simply meant to keep the dark company. The days that followed slipped into one another like calm tides. The air stayed cool, the sky stayed gray, and the sea, though never still, seemed gentler, almost thoughtful. Elias moved through his routines, as if within a song he'd known all his life. The lantern hummed above. The gulls returned, circling lazily through the wind. The smell of salt and iron wove through every breath he took, but the shell never left his desk. Sometimes, when the afternoon light fell across it, the pale pink shimmered faintly, like dawn remembered on a cloudy day. He liked to turn it in his hands, feeling its smooth surface, tracing the spiral that wound toward its silent heart. There was comfort in it, a reminder that even the smallest things carried entire worlds inside them. That morning, as the rain began again, Elias found himself thinking about stories. The ones people told about the sea, the legends of ghosts, shipwrecks, voices in the mist. He'd never truly believed in those, but he understood why people invented them. The sea was too big to look at plainly. You needed stories to soften it. He opened his notebook and began writing, though not a letter this time. Just a memory. "When I was a boy," he wrote, "my mother gave me a shell. She said if I listened closely, I'd hear the sea calling me home. I believed her for years. Even when we moved inland and the world turned dry, I kept that shell by my bed. When sleep was difficult, I'd hold it to my ear and pretend the wind through the window was the ocean's breath." He stopped there, smiling faintly. He hadn't thought about that in decades. It struck him how life had circled back, that he was once again listening to a shell, though this time the sea no longer needed to pretend. He continued writing. "The woman who came in yellow, she reminded me of that story, of how some people are carried here by the tide, not to stay, but to remind you that you're still seen. I don't know her name, but perhaps I don't need to. She brought the sea back into this room in a way the rain never could." He set down his pen and looked toward the window. The fog was thicker than before, rolling in from the horizon like breath on glass. The lighthouse beam swept across it, golden and gentle, cutting small corridors of visibility before dissolving again into white. He stood, put on his coat, and climbed to the lantern room. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of metal and salt sharper near the top. The glass windows were streaked with rain, bending the light into shimmering arcs that danced across the floor. Elias leaned against the railing and looked out. The world was nothing but fog and sound, waves folding into one another, the faint cry of gulls fading into distance. But when he pressed the shell to his ear again, he could hear something more, a murmur, low and rhythmic, like a story retold by water itself. He spoke softly, not to be heard but to be released. "I used to think you kept secrets," he said to the sea, "but now I think you're just patient. You wait for us to listen." The fog shifted slightly, revealing a thin silver line where water met air. A small wave rose and broke, glinting briefly like a smile. He stayed there for a long time, the lantern's beam sweeping past him in warm intervals, its rotation steady as breathing. It occurred to him then that every motion, the waves, the light, even the turning of the earth, was just another form of repetition, the universe's way of remembering itself. When he finally went back down, evening had already begun to settle. He made himself tea and lit the smaller lamp beside the desk. Its glow pooled softly across the wood, catching the edges of the shell and the letters stacked beneath it. He opened one of the older letters again, not to read, but to touch. The ink had faded into a soft sepia, the handwriting trembling slightly from years of damp. It was addressed, of course, to no one, but as his fingers traced the words, he could almost feel a pulse under the paper, faint, but their dot. He added a new line at the bottom, dated for the day. "The shell hums when the rain begins. I think it remembers more than I do." He signed it, not with his name, but with the small circle he always drew, a loop of light, a symbol of continuity. Then he slipped the page into the wooden box with the others. Outside, the wind began to rise again, but softly this time, the kind of wind that caresses rather than pushes. Elias closed his eyes and listened. It sounded like the past brushing gently against the present. He whispered to the shell, though he wasn't sure why. "If you ever see her again, tell her I kept the light steady." He placed it carefully on the windowsill, where the reflection of the lamp danced across its curve. For a brief moment, the light inside the lighthouse and the one in the eye, shell seemed to meet, two small circles of glow in a world that otherwise belonged to the dark. And Elias thought then that maybe that was what stories really were, not words or endings, but echoes. The sound something leaves behind when it's been loved enough to remember got the next day, arrived wrapped in silver fog. It wasn't the heavy kind that swallows the world, but a softer mist that drifted lazily between sea and sky, blurring everything it touched. From the top of the tower, Elias could barely distinguish where the ocean ended and the clouds began. It all seemed part of the same breath. He took his tea to the window and stood there a while, watching the fog roll in slow, patient waves. The light from the lantern above turned through it, scattering halos in the air, touching droplets that hovered like tiny stars. The world was hushed, as if holding its own heartbeat between pauses. He thought about the woman in the yellow coat, wondering whether she had made it safely back across the bay. He imagined her small boat rocking gently, the sea parting quietly around it, her hands steady on the oars. Somehow, he believed she had. People who carried calm with them rarely lost their way. He opened his notebook again, but this time he didn't write "Dear Sea." Instead, he wrote only one word, mercy. He let the ink soak into the page, thick and dark. It felt like a word too large for a small room, but somehow it fit. He wrote beneath it, "Some days mercy comes like sunlight. Others it hides in fog." The beam above moved in slow circles, keeping time with the rhythm of his thoughts. Elias closed the notebook, picked up his coat, and decided to walk the shoreline. It was something he rarely did during mornings like this. The rocks could be slick, the air too damp, but the fog felt more like an invitation than a warning. Outside, the world smelled of rain and salt, and something faintly sweet, maybe sea lavender, blooming somewhere unseen. His boots made small sounds on the wet stones. He followed the curve of the path down toward the edge of the cliffs, where the waves met the rock with soft, sighing motions. Down there, the tide had drawn back slightly, revealing smooth stones streaked with green moss. Pockets of water shimmered in their hollows, tiny mirrors reflecting the pale sky. He knelt beside one, tracing the outline of a small shell embedded in the stone, not unlike the one the woman had given him. He spoke aloud without meaning to. "You leave reminders everywhere, don't you?" The wind carried his words away almost at once, but it didn't matter. The act of speaking them was enough. He stayed there for a while, listening. Somewhere far off, a gull cried. Waves brushed the shore in slow, even breaths. The fog thickened, folding him gently into its quiet body. He felt, for the first time, not separate from it all, but woven into it, as if the sea, the sky, the light, and the man who kept it had become part of one long, unbroken rhythm. He thought of all the nights spent tending the lamp, all the letters written to the sea, all the moments he had mistaken solitude for loss when it had really been a kind of listening. Perhaps, he thought, this was what calm truly was, not the absence of storms, but the acceptance of them. The wind shifted slightly, brushing against his collar, and he took that as a sign to return. When he climbed the path again, his legs ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that reminded him he was still very much alive inside. He dried his hands, poured the last of the tea from the pot, and sat at his desk. He looked again at the shell on the windowsill. A small droplet of mist had settled inside its curve, catching the light like a bead of glass. He picked it up, held it to his ear, and smiled when he heard the faint hum, that same soft echo that always found its way back to him. "I used to think you were talking," he said softly, "but maybe you've been teaching me how to listen." He wrote another short note, smaller than the others. Today, the sea was gentle. The fog held everything close. "I think this is what peace looks like when no one's watching." He tore the page carefully from the notebook and folded it into thirds. Instead of placing it in the box, he slid it into the space beneath the lamp's base. A secret, small and hidden, left for no one but the light to keep. Outside, the fog began to lift. A faint glow spread across the horizon, touching the water with threads of pale gold. It wasn't bright, not yet, but enough to reveal the shape of things again. The cliffs, the rippling waves, the endless gray that slowly softened into blue. Elias stood there, watching it unfold. The day was quiet, the sea patient. He took a slow breath, the kind that filled the chest completely, then released it. Feeling something inside him settle with it, he whispered to the light, to the air, to the listening sea, "Whatever comes, I'll keep you burning." The words drifted outward and disappeared into the morning, but he imagined the fog carried them gently away, toward the woman in yellow, toward the horizon, toward anyone who needed to hear them. And as he watched the light turn once more through the clearing mist, Elias realized that perhaps mercy had always been this, the chance to begin again, even after the storms. That night, as the stars began to blink faintly through the thinning clouds, Elias sat beside the open window. The wind had shifted, calmer now, smelling faintly of kelp and pine carried from the distant shore. The lighthouse walls held the day's warmth, and the faint ticking of the old barometer was the only sound besides the sea's breathing below. He sat in the quiet with his hands around a cup of tea, gone lukewarm, not drinking, only holding. Sometimes, he thought, warmth wasn't about heat at all. It was about weight, about the small proof that something in your hands was still alive. On the desk beside him lay his box of letters. The lid was slightly open, the edges of old papers catching the lamplight. He reached out and brushed a thumb along the top one, feeling the texture, brittle, soft, uneven, like leaves pressed too long between pages. He'd written more than 100 of them through the years. Some had been small, just a few words when the sea was calm. Others had been longer, full of storms and memories, conversations with people who no longer existed anywhere except in him. He had always told himself he wrote for the sea, but tonight he admitted what he'd known all along. The letters were to himself. The sea had only been kind enough to listen. He pulled out one of the newer pages, dated last winter, and unfolded it. Dear Sea, I think regret is just love with nowhere to go. You carry so many of our unsaid things, don't you? The promises we broke, the words we swallowed, the faces that blurred too soon. Maybe that's why you're never still. Maybe movement is the only way to bear it. He read the words slowly, the way one might read an old friend's letter after years of silence. His eyes softened. Love with nowhere to go, he repeated quietly. Yes, that sounds right. He set the page down and leaned back in his chair. The sea outside murmured faintly against the rocks, and the lantern's light turned slow and golden through the fog. He thought of Lila again, how her laughter had filled the house by the bay, how she used to press her ear to his chest and say she could hear the sea inside him. He wondered, briefly, what she would think of this life he'd chosen. Perhaps she'd understand. Perhaps she always had. Elias turned his gaze toward the logbook, still open from earlier in the day. He picked up his pen and instead of another letter, began a different kind of note, one that felt like confession. I used to fear endings, he wrote. I mistook them for loss. But now I see that endings are only quiet corners where things change shape. I have lived many small lives here, each storm a chapter, each sunrise a page turned. And yet, it all feels like one long breath. He paused, the pen hovering above the page. Then he added, if I could speak to my younger self, I'd tell him, silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Sometimes it's just the world rearranging itself around you. He smiled faintly at that, set the pen down, and blew gently across the ink. The smell of it, metallic and earthy, mingled with the scent of the sea. He rose, took his lantern, and climbed the narrow stairs one more time. The steps groaned softly beneath him. Their sound as familiar as a lullaby. At the top, the night opened around him, a dark expanse of sky stitched with faint stars, the horizon glowing dimly where the moon hid behind clouds. The sea glimmered with broken silver, restless but calm. He walked to the great lens and ran his fingers along its smooth frame. The metal was cool beneath his touch. We've done well, haven't we? He whispered. You and I? The lantern's slow hum filled the silence, the light turning its endless circle, cutting across the black water dot. He stood there for a long time, breathing in rhythm with its rotation. Each sweep of light seemed to erase a little of the past, leaving only stillness behind Dot. As he turned to leave, he glanced once more through the glass. The beam had caught something a flash of yellow far below on the rocks, small but clear. His breath caught. It flickered once, then disappeared into fog. He didn't move for a moment. Perhaps it had been nothing, a trick of light, of memory. Or perhaps, he thought, some visitors never really leave. He descended the stairs slowly, his hand grazing the rail. When he reached the bottom, he lit one more lamp, smaller, softer, and set it near the window. Its glow spilled across the shell, turning it warm and alive. He opened his notebook and wrote one last line for the night. Regret is only love that hasn't found its shore. I think tonight it has. He left the lamp burning and went to bed. Outside, the sea sighed against the rocks, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled faint and kind. Like an echo remembering its way home, Elias closed his eyes and listened. not as a keeper of light, but as one of its many reflections. The night, gentle and infinite, held him without asking anything in return. The next morning broke softly, the kind of dawn that arrives without color, only brightness. The air outside the window shimmered faintly, heavy with mist and salt. Elias stirred awake to the quiet creak of the tower, settling into a new day. The storm had passed completely now. The world exhaled calm. He rose slowly, feeling the weight in his knees and the warmth of his wool blanket fading from his skin. When he stepped into the kitchen, the room greeted him with the faint smell of last night's lamp oil and dried sea air. He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and waited for the whistle, that small, faithful sound that marked the start of every morning. When the tea was ready, he carried it to the window. The horizon was blurred but peaceful, the water folded in long ribbons of silver and pale blue. He thought of the flash of yellow he'd seen last night and wondered if it had truly been there. Perhaps memory had learned how to take shape when the heart needed it to. He sipped quietly, then set the cup aside and reached for his logbook. He wrote in neat, deliberate strokes. Wind, calm. Sea, steady. Light, constant. He paused, then added beneath it, waited for a return that might already be here. He smiled faintly at the words half-truth. Half-prayer. After finishing his notes, Elias went to check the lantern, as he did every morning. The spiral staircase creaked beneath his boots. He ran his hand along the smooth iron rail, feeling the faint chill of the night still clinging to it. When he reached the top, the lantern room greeted him in soft gold. The lens stood gleaming from his last polish, its panels faintly warm from the night's light. The air smelled faintly of oil and the sea's damp breath. He opened one of the small windows to let in the morning wind. The cool air swept through, rustling the edges of his coat. He stood there a moment, looking out. The water was smooth, the horizon stitched with faint sunlight. And then, far away, he saw a small boat, pale against the silver water. It moved slowly, almost lazily, as if drifting rather than rowing. He leaned closer to the glass. The figure inside was barely visible, but he thought he saw that same flicker of yellow. His chest tightened, not with shock or disbelief, but with something gentler, a quiet gratitude. He didn't wave. He only stood there, hand resting on the window frame, eyes following until the fog swallowed her completely. He stayed in the lantern room long after that, polishing the brass, adjusting the wick, letting the light hum beside him like a companion. When the clock below struck noon, he descended the stairs, humming softly under his breath, the melody faint and unsteady, like a tune half remembered from another life. Downstairs, the shell still rested on the windowsill. The sunlight caught it perfectly now, making its surface gleam with soft pinks and creams. Elias sat by it, tracing the spiral once more. He pressed it to his ear and closed his eyes. The sound inside was different today, lighter, almost playful, like the sea whispering between laughter and sleep. He opened his notebook and wrote again, his pen moving easily across the page. Dear Sea, there was a time I thought every calm was a pause before another storm. Now I see that calm is the point apart we're meant to live inside. The rest is only how we learn to recognize it. You've taught me that. He looked up from the page. Outside, the sea sparkled faintly in the new light. The air was still cool, but softening, carrying the sound of distant gulls. He continued, someone once told me that tending a light for others will make you forget your own darkness. But I think they were wrong. The light doesn't erase the dark. It gives it shape. Without the night, the beam would have nowhere to land. He set the pen down and reread what he had written. The ink shimmered weightly, as if reflecting the same silver the sea was wearing outside. After a long pause, he folded the page and slipped it beneath the shell. It wasn't meant to be sealed away like the others, just left there, half open, like a conversation that could continue whenever the sea was ready. That evening, as the sun began to set, Elias climbed the tower once more. The horizon glowed amber and lavender, the kind of color the sea rarely allowed. The lantern's beam began to sweep through it, light gliding across gold and shadow, across memory and present. He stood beside it, his hand resting lightly on the brass rail. The warmth from the lamp spread through his palm, and he thought of how many nights this same light had cut through storms, how many unseen faces had trusted it to mean safety. He whispered into the glass, "Maybe we all need something to tend, something that reminds us we still matter, even when no one's watching." Below, the sea moved like silk. The light reached out, steady, unwavering. He stayed there until the sky turned completely blue-black, until the first star blinked faintly above the horizon. Then he turned down the wick just slightly, so the light breathed more softly, not shouting through the dark, but speaking to it. When he finally descended, he left the window open. The night air flowed in, smelling of salt and the slow rhythm of waves. He sat once more at his desk, listening. The lighthouse hummed around him. The sea answered in patient echoes. And for the first time in many years, Elias realized there was nothing left to wait for. The waiting itself had become peace. By dawn, the lighthouse was wrapped in stillness. The fog had lifted completely, leaving the world clear and tender, as though it had been washed and hung out to dry. Sunlight touched the water in soft fragments, scattering gold across the small ripples. The horizon stretched open and endless, a promise instead of a border. Elias woke before the light finished spilling into the room. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching the glow crawl along the walls, illuminating the old maps, the oil can, the notebook with its bent corner. Everything in this place had aged with him, weathered, softened, but enduring. He rose, lit the stove, and boiled water for tea. The steam curled upward, carrying the scent of leaves and the faint metallic tang of the kettle. Outside, gulls traced lazy arcs through the air, their wings flashing white against the blue. He carried his tea outside today. The stones beneath his boots were warm from the morning sun, and the air was cool enough to keep him awake. He sat on the low step near the door and looked out toward the horizon. A soft wind brushed against his face. The sea was quiet, not still, never still, but content. The waves moved like long sighs, each one fading gently into the next. Elias took a sip, letting the warmth settle deep inside him. He thought about the woman again. Perhaps she had returned home. Perhaps she was somewhere far off, looking toward the same stretch of horizon, thinking of the light that still turned for her. The thought made him smile, not from longing, but from quiet satisfaction. Some meetings, he had come to understand, were meant only to remind us that the world is still capable of kindness. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened. The sounds of the sea, the rustle of the wind, the steady heartbeat of the lantern above, they blended into something wordless and whole. It was like being inside a song that didn't need melody. When he went back inside, the morning sun had reached the window, spilling over the desk. It lit the shell on the sill, painting it in soft light. Inside the shell, a tiny droplet of seawater shimmered like a jewel. Elias touched it carefully, feeling its coolness before it rolled onto his fingertip. He smiled. "Still listening, aren't you?" He sat down and opened his notebook. The ink from yesterday's entry had dried into soft brown. He turned to a new page and began to write without hesitation, as if the words had been waiting overnight. "Dear Sea, this morning I am thinking about small things, shells, footsteps, the steam from my tea. They seem unimportant, yet they are the only things that ever stay. Maybe that's your lesson. Not grandeur, not power, just endurance, just grace. He paused, looking out the window. The sunlight shimmered through the glass, warm against his cheek. He continued, I have spent years tending your light, years watching you rage and soften, take and return. And I think I understand now you don't teach in words. You teach by staying, by returning, no matter how far you've gone. He laid down the pen and rested his hands on the open page. A long breath escaped him, slow and deep. It felt like something uncoiling, not sorrow, not relief, just release. After a while, he stood and went to the lantern one more time. The stairs no longer felt as heavy as they once did. His steps were slower, yes, but sure. When he reached the top, the sunlight poured through the glass, scattering across the polished brass dot. The lantern didn't need him this morning. It turned smoothly, its beam cutting through air, so clear it seemed invisible. Elias stood beside it anyway, one hand resting on the cool frame, the other on his heart. He stayed there, eyes half closed, breathing in the light. For the first time, he didn't feel separate from it, not the keeper of it, but part of it. The day stretched on gently. By afternoon, he took his meal outside: bread, fruit, and a small jar of honey he'd been saving. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, as though time itself had thinned and softened. Later, when the sun began to slide lower, Elias lit the smaller lamp inside the room. Its glow mingled with the afternoon light, gold folding into gold. The air smelled faintly of salt and dust and sweetness. He picked up the shell again and turned it in his hands. For a long moment, he just looked at it, its spiral, its quiet perfection. Then, on impulse, he pressed it against his heart. Thank you, he whispered. He placed it back on the sill, exactly where the evening light would touch it last. As the sun began to sink, the water outside shimmered with rose and gold, and the air hummed with a stillness that felt alive. Elias stood by the window, teacup empty in his hand, and watched the horizon fold into itself. When the first star appeared, faint and fragile, he whispered, I think we made it. Then he smiled, not to anyone, not even to himself, just to the moment, to the sea, to the light that still turned, faithful and calm. He went to bed early that night. The world outside was soft with color, the waves brushing the shore in steady rhythm. The light continued its slow rotation above, casting a single circle of gold across the sleeping sea. And somewhere in that hush, between breath and dream, Elias felt it not an ending, but a deep, quiet completeness. When Elias woke again, the sea was silver. Morning light shimmered through thin clouds, brushing the waves with quiet grace. The lighthouse walls glowed faintly pale gold and soft gray, like an old photograph touched by sun. He sat up slowly, the wooden floor cooled beneath his bare feet, and listened. The world was whispering. Gulls in the distance, the faint roll of tide, the low hum of the lamp above. Everything alive, everything gentle. He brewed his tea and carried it upstairs to the lantern room. The air was cool but bright, smelling of salt and glass and the faint sweetness of polished brass. He leaned his shoulder against the wall, watching the beam glide over the water, in its slow rhythm a language of light he no longer needed to translate. He spoke softly, not to anyone in particular. You're steady today. Outside, the sea answered with a soft lap against the rocks. The surface gleamed in small, trembling patterns of light, and Elias thought of how the world always seemed to begin again after rain, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. He took another sip of tea and opened the window. The wind that entered was cool, carrying the taste of the horizon. He could see, faintly, the trace of a small boat far away, or maybe just the glimmer of sunlight on water. He didn't strain to tell the difference. Some things were meant to remain uncertain. He set down his cup and took out his notebook. opening to a blank page. The last letter he'd written sat beneath the shell, still slightly curved where the paper had dried. He ran his fingers over the words, then began again. Dear C, you've been quiet these days. I think you're listening. I think you always were. I used to speak to you to fill the silence, but now I write because the silence feels like a reply. He paused, smiling faintly at the thought. Last night I dreamed the storm returned, but it wasn't frightening. It was music, deep, slow, and warm. You were there, and so was she, the woman in yellow. We didn't say anything. We only watched the light move across the waves. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the image settle the lantern's beam. A sound of rain, the faint smell of tea. I used to think peace would come when everything stopped, he wrote, but now I see it's the space between things. Between storms, between breaths, between one heartbeat and the next. He lifted the pen, drew the familiar small circle below the words, his quiet signature, then closed the notebook and pressed his palm over it. When he stepped back to the window, the sunlight had changed. The sky was brighter now, the color of faded linen, and the water shimmered in slow motion. A faint rainbow arched near the horizon, fragile, almost transparent. Elias exhaled softly. You always did like to surprise me. He stayed there for a long while, watching the light play on the waves. The rainbow thinned, faded, and then disappeared, leaving behind only the gleam of afternoon. Later, he went down to the kitchen, lit the small fire, and cooked a simple meal: bread, soup, a few herbs dried long ago and saved for days like this. The air filled with warmth and faint spice. He ate slowly, the kind of eating that was less about hunger and more about being present. Afterward, he walked outside. The path around the lighthouse was dry again, the grass still shining with drops from last night's dew. The rocks glowed warm in the sunlight. He sat on his usual spot, overlooking the cliffs, his knees drawn close, and watched the waves move below, each one folding into the next, like a thought finding rest. He looked at the horizon and spoke softly, though there was no one near. You know, he said, I used to think I was here to guard the light, but maybe the light was here to guard me. The sea shimmered back at him, gold threading through blue. He thought of the years that had passed, of all the storms, the solitude, the laughter he could still hear if he closed his eyes. It wasn't regret that filled him now, but wonder. How strange it was. He thought that peace could come not from holding on, but from understanding that everything had already arrived. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the smell of the sea closer. It brushed through his hair, through the loose threads of his coat, through the silence that hung like music between them. He stayed until the sun began to fall. The light turned softer, richer, amber on the rocks, bronze on the water. When the first star appeared, Elias stood and whispered, You can rest now. Then he turned and walked back toward the tower. Inside, the lantern waited, steady, patient. He climbed the stairs one last time for the evening, his hand trailing along the rail. At the top, he trimmed the wick, checked the oil, and watched the beam sweep into the deepening blue. The lighthouse breathed around him, wood, wind, and light in quiet conversation. He stood there, eyes reflecting the glow. Thank you, he murmured to the sea, to the sky, to the years, for staying. And in the hush that followed, a sound rose, not quite words, not quite song, a gentle rush of air through glass, like the sea exhaling in answer. Elias smiled, his silhouette framed in gold, and whispered into the turning light, I hear you. That night, the wind was still. No waves struck the rocks with force. No thunder waited beyond the horizon. The sea lay open and quiet beneath the beam of the lighthouse, its surface trembling with faint reflections of stars. Inside, The air was warm from the lamp's long breath, carrying the soft scent of salt and brass. Elias sat at his desk with the window open, listening to the slow rhythm of the tide. His hands rested on his knees, a shell beside him catching bits of moonlight. He hadn't written anything all evening. There was nothing left to say, not really, and somehow it felt like the truest ending of all. The notebook lay open before him, its last page blank, the pen resting quietly on top. He turned the pages one by one, glancing at old lines, faded ink, small notes in the margins, words written in storms, in stillness, in laughter, in grief. Together, they told a story, though not one meant to be read. A story written only to be lived. He poured himself a final cup of tea and set it beside the notebook. The steam curled upward, blurring the edge of the lamp's glow. "You've been patient with me," he said aloud, his voice roughened by time but still soft. "All these years, and you never asked for more than care." He looked toward the window. The sea was visible, silver and endless, the kind of beauty that didn't shout. A few gulls floated in the distance, sleeping on the water. The moon, half hidden behind clouds, laid a path of light that stretched directly to the shore below. Elias reached for his pen, and after a long pause, wrote on the final page, "Dear Sea, I think this will be my last letter. Not because I've run out of words, but because I've finally learned to listen without them. You've shown me that silence is not emptiness. It's a home. It's where everything returns when it's ready to rest." He set the pen down, letting the ink dry in peace. "Do you know," he continued softly, though no longer writing, "there's a comfort in knowing the light will go on, even when no one sees it. Maybe that's what faith is. Not being needed, but shining anyway." The lamp flickered slightly, its flame bowing, then rising again. Elias smiled. "I suppose that's your way of agreeing." He closed the notebook gently and tied it with the same string he'd used for years. Then he placed it in the wooden box with all the others, tucking the shell inside too, resting it atop the letters like a seal of quiet understanding. He stood, stretching slowly, and walked toward the spiral stairs. The lantern room awaited above, humming with its familiar low music. Each step echoed softly, wood meeting wood, breath meeting breath. At the top, he paused. The glass panels were clear tonight, the stars visible through every angle of the lens. The beam turned its calm rotation, touching each corner of the horizon before fading into night. He approached the lamp and adjusted the wick one final time, the flame steady beneath his hand. Outside, the sea was nearly motionless. It looked less like water and more like breath, vast, invisible, alive. Elias leaned on the rail and looked outward. He thought of Lila, of the woman in yellow, of every quiet evening that had carried him here. None of them felt far away. Time, he realized, was less a river and more a tide, always retreating, always returning. He whispered, "You kept your promise." The wind shifted slightly, lifting his hair, moving gently through the open glass. In that moment, he imagined the sea speaking back, not with words, but with the soft pulse of the waves below, as if the earth itself had leaned closer to answer. He took a slow breath, letting the salt fill his lungs, then turned down the light just enough that it glowed. Not a beacon now, but a companion. The room dimmed into gold and shadow. He sat near the window, the same place he had written his first letter all those years ago. The air hummed softly. The world was perfectly balanced between sound and silence. He whispered his final words, barely louder than the sea itself. "I'll keep the lamp steady. That's my promise to you." Outside, the beam turned, one more slow revolution over the calm sea. Each sweep brushed the waves with light, like a hand smoothing a wrinkle from a blanket. Elias closed his eyes, listening. The lighthouse breathed. The sea exhaled. The stars blinked above like small, patient answers. And in that quiet, that gentle, endless quiet, he smiled. The night held him tenderly, and the light kept turning.